Welcome to Dig Deep, the mining podcast. In this podcast, we go deep into mining news, hot topics, and live interviews with mining professionals and leading figures in the mining industry. Introducing your host, Rob Tyson, founder and director of Mining International and Mining International Executive, a leading global mining recruitment and headhunting agency.
Hi mining community, welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep of the Mining Podcast. And today's guest is Brooke Bibeault, who's the CEO of Makor Resources, an African junior miner exploring, then developing the next generation of world-leading mines across the artisanal and small-scale sector. They enable artisanal and small-scale businesses in the raw material value chain, from mine to main street, production to retail, to manage risks, build resilience, sourcing strategies, capture value, and invest for social impact to address some of today's most pressing concerns. Brooke has a diverse background in leadership and development and a business strategy, and has become the CEO of Makor Resources in 2019 when she moved to Africa. She's going to give us a background to the company, her mission to help artisanal miners develop locally and ethically sourced materials, her new AI platform, Sensr 360, and her new podcast, Mine to Main Street, and a lot more. Before I start, I just want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Hawcroft, who are leaders in property risk management in the mining industry since 1992. They offer insurance risk surveys, construction risk reviews, and asset critically assessments and more. Working across 600 sites globally, Hawcroft supports mining, processing, smeltering, power, refining, ports and rail operations. So if you're looking for any property and insurance risk management service in the mining industry, then visit their website at www.hawcroft.com, and all the details are in the show notes. Brooke, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thanks, Rob. I'm really excited to be here with you, maybe in different parts of the world, but excited to be here nonetheless.
Yeah, great. So just wondering if you just tell us a little bit about your background. As I mentioned in the introduction, you have a bit of a diverse background. So I just wondered if you could just run us through your career, what you've been doing and how you got into the mining industry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you get this a lot, but I'll start with, I don't think I ever intended to end up in mining, and somehow this is where I've ended up, and it's honestly probably the only place I want to be. But, you know, my career really has always been about, if I had to like sum it up, it's been about solving high stake problems really at the intersection of power, Rob, and looking at economics and global impact at the same way. And my pathway into mining was certainly not a straight line, but I'd say it started at the front lines of humanitarian aid. Interesting thing to talk about, which we won't get into here. It's a very timely topic. And I really was working in some of the most complex and volatile regions in the world. And I think that experience really shaped my understanding of, and maybe indirectly at that time, but my understanding of how resources, from who controls them, who profits from them, who gets left behind, define economies, define stability, and really opportunity out in the world. So I would see firsthand, you know, how entire communities could be both built or broken based on access to the right materials. And it might be at the most basic level, infrastructure, roads, hospitals, energy, technology, but none of that really happens without the materials, you know, beneath our feet. So I think in those same regions, I saw the darker side of the equation, the exploitation, the corruption, the resource-driven conflict in economies that were built on extraction rather than wealth creation, Rob. I spent lots of time in North Africa in my early career. I lived in Egypt for many years, and I think I always laugh because I grew up in pageants, and I had this perspective that I could change the world, you know, world peace. And there is still something about me deep down that is this driving force. And I think maybe I've shifted away from world peace now that I'm a little bit wiser with a bit more experience to, I just want to create workability in the world. So that's, you know, that when I look at my career, everything that I did thereafter was to create workability. I spent many years in corporate consulting, working with mining companies to local tourism strategies, to big city tourism strategies and economic development planning, to startups. So it was really a very broad range, but looking at everything from risk, investment strategy, marketing, positioning. And I think it was during those very fundamental years that I learned how big capital moves. Who gets funding, how deals are structured, how industries scale. And I saw how big corporations honestly build empires, to be honest with you, and they do it because of the resources that they have. And they fail to see the vulnerabilities that exist in their supply chain, even ones that you don't think necessarily have any relationship to supply chain. And they overlook a lot of risks, especially early on. I think there's more attention being paid to that, and we'll talk about that now. But they overlook the geopolitical volatility. They overlook those hidden compliance failures. And it was something that we wanted to bring to the spotlight when I was doing a lot of that work, and we did it through our messaging. It was how are we going to communicate to people in a way that was going to land in that? And messaging really shifted to me becoming a masterful marketer, because you have to learn how to tell a story. And I marketed everybody from, again, like I said, these large cities to smaller tourism strategies to a lot of celebrities. So I worked very closely with the mainstream audiences to do things from building foundations to merging their influence and impact that they're having in the world and telling that story out there. So it's been quite a big range of things that I've done, but I think, again, what it's come down to is what has been that driving force for me? What are the things that I've always seen in the synergies? And I've worked really mine to Main Street now. And for me now with Makor, there's a lot of things, and we'll talk about what we're doing, but it's once you control the narrative, I think you control the industry, and perception drives markets. And I think it influences investor sentiment and consumer demand and regulatory policy. And I've seen over the years how industries can be reshaped, not just by raw data, but by the story that they're telling and the truth that they're revealing. And that's really where I see that it's all connected. So we've built Makor Resources. I stepped in as the CEO to really bridge that gap, Rob, bridge the gap between responsible sourcing and ethical mining and investment security, because I knew that the only way to shift the industry, and the industry requires lots of change. We've made lots of progress, but it requires lots of change. It was to make sustainability profitable and to make risk transparent and to make mining investment ready. And that's where I'm at today.
Yeah. You've obviously recently moved to Africa and you're originally from the US. How have you found the differences, obviously living in Africa compared to living in the US? And do you miss the US?
Wow, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I left the US for the first time many years ago. Like I said, I was living in North Africa in Egypt, and then I moved back to North America for some time, and I'm back in Africa now for, well, the last 6 years. And obviously, I appreciate where I come from, and my family's all there, so I do miss that a lot. But I'm very happy where we're at this point. Africa is different. I'd say that it highlights all the senses in my body, to be honest with you. It's one of the most beautiful places and most difficult places that I've ever lived. And granted, we live in Cape Town, so I think that overall it's relatively developed compared to what you get in other African nations. But we travel a lot to these other African nations, and it's really humbled me. So my goal, my husband and I's goal was, we've got 2 kids with another little one on the way, is we wanted them to be immersed in that. I think I grew up in a very disconnected fashion, if I want to be honest with you. Very, very right-wing, very disconnected. And I didn't realize even the poverty that would exist and the gaps that existed in my own backyard. And I've gotten exposed to that a lot by living in Africa. So all of our kids are homeschooled. They travel with us in and out of mine sites and communities. And it's really about how is it that we can immerse them in real-world experiences while giving them the education that they need. So though I miss my family, I'm very happy where we're at.
Yeah, good. Just wondering if you just tell us a little bit about Makor Resources. And obviously you've taken a unique approach by focusing on artisanal and small-scale mining. Why did you decide to focus on that sector, and what potential do you see that others are potentially overlooking?
Yeah, I mean, I guess before I give you the story of Makor, we spent many years, even before Makor started, traveling across Africa and living at different mine sites. My husband, he's spent the last 30 years in mining. So what happens is you travel around the world together and you live in the different areas that they're working inside of. So he spent lots of time from the northern parts of Africa to the southern parts, the eastern to the western parts. And we would see often a lot of, we would call them illegals, illicit mining activity. And our relationship to it was that it was very frustrating because we didn't totally understand the context behind it. Especially, you can imagine when it's a large scale entity, it almost occurs as this burden. But as we have evolved and as our careers have evolved, we spent a lot more time understanding it from their context as opposed to from the context of running a large scale mine. So Makor Resources was built on this belief that mining at every level should really be an engine of wealth creation, Rob. It's not just for large corporations, but also for the communities that sit on top of these resources. And I think when you look at artisanal and small scale mining, and maybe we'll refer to it as ASM, even though I don't like to do that, it represents really one of the largest untapped, I believe, economic potentials when it comes to global resource sector. It accounts for a significant percentage of the global mineral production, from newly mined gold to gemstones to diamonds, and really a growing share of cobalt and copper and other critical minerals. And people don't often realize that. I think it's often dismissed as this like informal and high risk and outside of the scope of large scale investment. You don't go there, don't talk about it. But in my perception, I believe that though it's valid, it's completely outdated. I think South Africa, for instance, we're living there now a majority of the time. It's been this spotlight lately due to what the local South African people are calling the zama-zamas, or the illegal miners. That's how they refer to them. And I think in the DRC, it's really similar. But when people talk about ASM, they often relate to it as it's all illegal or all illicit activity. And that's not always the case, So I think we need to educate ourselves on the different frameworks around artisanal and small scale, very different things, mining, the different levels of legality and illicit activity, and the different jurisdiction offerings, because it really is truly across the board. And it's everything from criminality and warlord activity through to countries that are just benefiting off of the chaos that it's creating, through to they don't even know that there is legislation in place to be able to formalize or not. They're just trying to survive. So I think what people fail to see is that ASM isn't going anywhere. It's expanding, to be honest with you. And I think it's particularly true in resource-rich regions like Africa. It's become a primary source of people's livelihoods. It supports more than 40 million people worldwide. And the problem isn't necessarily the existence of ASM. I think it's the fact that it hasn't really been formalized or financed or structured in a way that allows it to operate responsibly and at scale. And it's only going to get worse. I think especially with a lot of aid funding that's getting cut, people are going to have no other choice and try to find alternatives. And so we saw this massive opportunity and a massive market inefficiency. Investors pour billions of dollars into LSM projects, but they're often ignoring a sector that with the right investment and right governance structure could be legitimate, could be ESG compliant source of wealth creation. So we've really applied this structure of financing, integrating risk intelligence, and then using data to verify not only supply chain transparency, but also how is it that we can turn ASM into this investable asset rather than something that's an overlooked risk.
There's obviously a common misconception, as you've mentioned, that artisanal mining is informal, high risk, and not investment ready. How do you challenge that narrative? And how is Makor turning these operations into investable, ESG compliant sources of wealth?
Yeah, I think number one, as I said, I love being able to take control of the narrative, but I do understand why artisanal and small scale mining has been seen as risky because it operates often in jurisdictions with weak governance and geopolitical instability. It's often unregulated. And I think historically it's been linked to obviously not just environmental damage, but also human rights concerns. But when you take a step back, it's actually not that different than what large-scale mining companies have often done as well. And I'll tell you, there has been a lot of progress. Obviously, there's a lot of legislation around it in governing bodies that manage it, but we still see it with large-scale companies today being in Africa. So, risk isn't a fixed concept. It's not something that can be quantified or managed or even de-risked with the right strategy. I think one of the biggest challenges in artisanal or small-scale mining communities is that they're being locked out of global markets. So they're forced to operate in informal and unregulated systems that limit their own earning potential. And we believe that by integrating ASM into these very transparent and investment-grade supply chains, then we turn this high-risk, highly volatile sector into something that is far more legitimate and bankable. I was recently just yesterday in field visiting a couple of gold mines. It was actually, they're licensed, so it's formal, and there are informal, unlicensed artisanal miners that are paying rent to the person that owns the licensed land. And so in their mind, for instance, they're doing it totally above board and they are legitimate and they're operating within their own business, they're running their own business. And for us, it's about how can we ensure that we bridge those two worlds and we connect them and we educate miners in the way that they're really clear on what it is that they need to be doing to formalize themselves, get them access to the right markets, ensure they get their fair share of the value chain. So we don't see ASM is this like informal, chaotic industry, but we see it as something that's a fragmented structure that's really in need of more structure. So what we're doing is we're applying those same financial disciplines, same supply chain oversight, same investment intelligence, which we'll talk about a bit, that you would see in a large scale mining company, but adapted in the context and realities of ASM. So I think in order to challenge the narrative and shift the narrative on a global scale, we need to, number one, educate the industry. I think we need to educate investors, and we need to educate the world on the part of the sector that there's this often like misconception around, but also lots of preconceived notions about, but they don't realize the role. We don't realize the role that we play in driving ASM activity. So we focus on a couple of key areas, Rob. Number one is economic empowerment through formalization. So like I said, a huge percentage of the world's minerals, especially gold, come from artisanal and small scale miners. And they're often locked out of those global markets and forced to sell at very exploitative prices. So they're exposed to very dangerous conditions by virtue. So instead of treating them as a liability, we integrate them into formal economies. We ensure that they're paying royalties back to the government. We ensure that local economies are getting their fair share of the value chain. And what that does is it provides fair pricing, safer technology, and access to not only investment grade supply chains, but to broader markets. And it makes everybody much happier. And it weeds out the bad players, because there is illicit players and traders that happen in the process, but eventually that gets exposed and they simply cannot keep up. We also look at infrastructure and long-term value creation. So, I think mining companies often think of community engagement as building a school or donating to a local charity, but it's a very short-term PR-driven approach, and it doesn't create lasting change. So we think much bigger when we're going into these ASM communities in particular. I believe that true impact means not just investing in infrastructure and local entrepreneurship, but it's actually creating the ecosystems that outlive the life of the mine. So, for example, instead of just providing temporary jobs at a mine site, we actually help create these parallel industries that sustain the economy way beyond extraction. And that could be things like agriculture to processing facilities or financial services, but they're allowing local businesses to thrive, and they're benefiting from us, but we're also providing them with the resources to benefit long beyond us. So that's how you create a economic engine rather than a boom bust industry, which I often like to talk about. And then the last one is we look at transparency and community first governance. So I think, again, many mining companies, and I've seen it, I've done it myself, and obviously doing a very different approach now, but you operate with this top-down approach. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just different than our approach. But you make decisions in corporate boardrooms with very little input from the communities that are actually living with the consequences. So we flipped that model on the head. We actually made the move to Zambia at some point to be on the ground, especially while we were building this out. And we wanted to make sure that before we even break ground, we're there. Personally, we are working directly with local leaders and traditional leaders and civic leaders and artisanal miners and small business owners to ensure that the development aligns with their needs and priorities. I always say to people, yes, the world depends on mining, but we forget that mining depends on communities. So, and it's not about a charity. It's actually about strategic alignment. So it's creating a stable, thriving community that makes mining operations more secure, more profitable, and really more resilient to geopolitical risk in the long term.
Yeah. Obviously, you speak to a lot of artisanal miners probably on a daily basis. What do they think of the mainstream mining companies? What is their perception of our industry? And I suppose, do any artisanal miners make that move into the mainstream mining companies at all?
Yeah.
Is that their goal or not? Not at all.
To be honest with you, not really. They're completely unfazed by the large scale companies. I think they often feel like they have there's not even a chance of being able to work alongside those mining companies. So you'll see sometimes outside of large scale mine operations, these artisanal miners will go and they'll start mining the tailings, and you'll see encroachment onto land. But it's because they don't even see that there could be a conversation, right? That's not even, I think, in their trajectory of thinking. And I don't know, De Beers has done an amazing job with their Gem Fair initiative to support artisanal miners. So there are definitely companies that are creating initiative to work with artisanal and small scale operators. But I don't know if successfully as an industry, we have integrated them into our own operations as large scale companies. And that's one of the things that we're working to do. So, the other arm of Makor, we work with large scale companies to be able to address and facilitate a lot of these conversations that are happening, because it is a very likely reality that there will be some form of ASM activity, especially if you are operating in Africa. So we facilitate those conversations to say, how is it that we can employ artisanal miners, formalize artisanal miners, give them access to work and alternatives to their current livelihoods, and then they understand. But I don't think it's in their trajectory of thinking otherwise.
You said that mining isn't just about extraction, it's about obviously wealth creation. Just wonder if you can expand on that, and how does mining actually drive economic resilience on a global scale?
Yeah. I think mining is often framed as this like means to an end. So you dig something up, you sell it, and then you move on. But mining, it's really the foundation of economic resilience and across the world, and it's a driver of wealth creation at every level of the global economy. I say that it's the start of supply chains. And if I had to think about a food chain, it'd be at the top of the food chain, because it fuels innovation and progress and technology. So it's not just about extraction. I think it's about value creation. It's about financial security, and it is about, industry development. And if you break it down, you can look at a couple of things. I think number one, it creates resource-backed economies. So nations with very strong mining industries have more control over their economic destiny and stability. Australia is a great example. Canada, even Botswana and Chile. Mining doesn't just generate revenue in these areas. It really creates these entire ecosystems of industry and trade and employment. I think mining is also a hedge against economic volatility. So when financial markets are unstable, commodities like gold, which is only continuing to grow right now, become safe haven assets. And mining provides stability in times of crisis. I think it contributes to job creation and local wealth generation. I think a well-run mine operation doesn't just benefit a handful of corporations, but it really fuels entire supply chains and local businesses and infrastructure projects. And a well-structured mining company isn't just, extracting, it's reinvesting in those profits into things like education and healthcare and industrialization, which creates long-term value for future generations. I'd say it's also about investment security and global trade. It's one of those most undervalued investment opportunities, yet it's also responsible for materials that power renewable energy and global tech industries. And what I love is luxury markets, especially because on the luxury side, we often don't even connect it to the mining that happens to make that happen. So I think the more we recognize mining as this investment multiplier, rather than a cost center, then the faster we can bridge the gap between raw materials and long-term economic growth. But it's not just about the rocks in the ground. I think it's about the financial systems, the infrastructure, the wealth-building industries that really define entire economies, Rob. And the challenge now is, how can we ensure that mining is transparent, it's sustainable, and it's investment ready? Because I believe that that's where the long-term value really lives.
A lot of mining conversations focus on profitability and ESG compliance, but you've been obviously vocal around the importance of obviously community impact. Yes. How does Makor Resources ensure that obviously mining benefits the people on the ground and not just investors at the top?
Yeah, so I have been very vocal. I remember maybe about 6 months ago, I did see that there was lots of irresponsible practices that was happening in our doorstep communities, which is also a shared doorstep community with a large scale company. And I was quite vocal with that company about that. And it was more so to stand for, you say you're doing one thing, you're reporting on one thing, but there's a gap in what's actually happening on the ground. And I remember an executive at that company called for a conversation, and one of the things that he said to me is, "You're just one of those sustainability people, one of those social do-gooders." And I laugh at that, because I think I definitely am one of those things. But I'm also, I believe that it can contribute to the broader wealth creation of the world. As I previously said, I think one of the biggest failures of traditional mining and a traditional mining model is that too much value gets extracted and too little gets reinvested into the communities that are closest to those resources. People often call them the host communities or doorstep communities. I say it's actually the communities that host us, because, obviously encouragement happens, but most of those times, those people were on those lands long before us. So I think for people that have spoken about this issue with me, they'll realize that there's this notion that resources alone can't create prosperity, or they can create prosperity, but I believe that they don't. But I do believe that it could be a source of mineral wealth if it's used in the right way. And so I think it's the systems around the resources, the policies, the governance, the community engagement that will ultimately determine whether or not a region's going to thrive or collapse. And so where mining companies get it wrong, in my opinion, is that they prioritize short-term profit over long-term stability. So it's not a quick win. It's a decades-long economic driver. It's long-dated, capital-intensive. And I think if a company extracts resources without reinvesting in things like infrastructure, workforce development, and long-term economic stability for the communities, not for their own operations, then they're leaving behind nothing but environmental damage and social unrest, and that's high risk, low value strategy that ultimately costs more, whether it be through permitting issues or regulatory backlash or operational instability. We've seen a lot of that in recent times with people losing their license to operate and getting kicked out of regions. I also believe that, as a industry, we sometimes have this unfortunate ability of treating communities as an afterthought instead of a strategic partner. So, too many mining companies see community engagement as like a checkbox. It's a checkbox exercise, something that gets addressed after the operation starts. But I think in reality, the community buys into, and their buy-in is really going to be one of the single most important determinants of whether or not a project is going to succeed or fail. And companies that operate, I think, without that local support, they're going to face things like protests and shutdowns and reputational damage that will kill investment faster than any other commodity downturn. So we've seen companies, obviously, like I said, recently lose their license to operate, and that's a huge factor as to why. And I would also say the last thing is that they underestimate the power of informal economies. Small-scale mining communities in particular, they're not just a labor force. They are this economic ecosystem with their own supply chains, their own trade networks, their own social structures. And when companies come in and they try to impose, and we're all guilty of it, these Western-style corporate structures, because we think it's the right thing to do, but we don't really understand those dynamics. What happens is we create way more resistance than cooperation.
You co-founded Sensr 360, which is a platform that brings AI-driven risk intelligence and ESG verification to mining. How does Sensr 360 differentiate between real ESG compliance and companies that are greenwashing? And what kind of patterns or red flags do you detect that others are actually missing?
Yeah, well, first of all, Rob, let me ask you a question back. What do you think is one of the biggest mistakes that investors make, especially in the mining sector?
Well, I suppose anyone that's invested in the mining industry are looking for a quick return. And obviously the mining is a long-term game, and everyone is probably comparing the mining industry to other industries, and I think they're completely, mining's its own industry, and obviously everyone's looking for quick returns. You just look at the crypto market at the moment, where people are probably investing in crypto rather than potentially investing in our mining industry because there's quicker returns in crypto. So that's my thought.
No, but that's exactly it. I think people see it as a short-term play, and the reality of it is it's not like tech. It doesn't just pivot overnight or ride this like interesting speculative wave. I said it a moment ago. It's long dated, it's capital intensive, it's a strategic long horizon industry. But it also doesn't mean that it's stagnant. And so I think the right mining investments, they're going to be hedges against inflation, against geopolitical instability and resource scarcity. So what investors, in my opinion, often get wrong, and I give lots of opinions here, but again, this is just what I can assert based on my own experience, is that they don't factor in geopolitical risk correctly. I think you start to see a bit of wariness, especially when it comes around assets in Africa, but overall, it's not going to be something that's at the forefront. A project might have really high grade resources, for instance, but if the regulatory, social, even security risks aren't accounted for, it's going to be a ticking time bomb. They rely on an outdated due diligence method. I think we often, especially investors, trust these surface level ESG reports. There's nothing wrong with them, or corporate disclosures, but there's no independent verification. So once you get on the ground, you can oftentimes be very surprised by the gap of what's in the report versus the reality that exists. And then I think they understand the strategic power of metals. So, but they underestimate it. So the demand for obviously copper, lithium, rare earths, gold, it's not declining, it's only accelerating. And I think that those investors who really understand the supply chain dependencies behind those renewables and tech and luxury goods, they're going to be the ones that will capture the long-term value. So what we did is we decided to use technology, ground truthing, and then AI to better the technology. And we launched a platform. And we launched a platform that would address where all of those risk factors that we just briefly talked about would really be identifiable, monitoring, and then be able to mitigate those risks. So we believe that the opportunity really lives in leveraging technology. A lot of people might differ, but that is really the way that the world is going, and we've been able to prove that concept now. So we de-risk through intelligence, and then we play the long game. And I think that's where platforms like Sensr 360 is going to make the biggest difference, and is starting to make a big difference. We're now working in Kenya and in Zambia and South Africa, and we do it to eliminate blind spots, to identify risks before they materialize, and then to help investors deploy capital where it actually makes sense. So ultimately, we've developed this platform because we don't just analyze data. What we're doing is we're interpreting real world risks. We're giving investors and mining companies this unfiltered look at actually what is happening on the ground. And a big element of that is, in your question that you asked me, is going to be on ESG verification. So I think that there's a lot of companies that are doing really great things around this, but I think things like ESG and sustainability, they've also become a bit of a buzzword, that checkbox, and I don't know how often we sit back and say, well, what does this actually really mean? And we've seen so many companies that are using sustainability claims as this like branding tool rather than actually going and implementing real change. And I think, unfortunately, things like greenwashing happens when companies say the right thing, but they don't actually change their behavior. So we cut through all of that noise. And we do that by using real-time data. We use satellite intelligence. We use remote sensoring technology, and then forensic ESG verification, or ground truthing is probably the more simplistic way to say it. But to spot those discrepancies on what's actually being reported and what's happening. So some of the things we're able to detect that others miss is undisclosed deforestation and land uses that are contradicting ESG claims, for example. We can look at patterns of human movement and heat movement that indicate trafficking or forced labor. Modern day slavery is still a huge issue in the world, but particularly around mining operations. We look at things like illicit supply chain activity, so we can track materials that are supposedly conflict-free and see if they're being sourced in a ethical, responsible way, or if they're being sourced from high-risk zones. And then we look at regulatory inconsistencies. So we can identify things like mining operations that claim compliance but have these hidden legal, environmental, or permitting issues. And I think that's really only one element of it. We've used that in ground truthing to be able to demonstrate and assess a number of other risk factors as well. But the core focus for us is going to be on looking at the environment and the social elements. And I believe that the technology is, particularly important because it ensures for responsible and sustainable investments. And that is really the way that not just this sector is evolving, but the world is evolving. Sustainability is so much more than that ethical checkbox. It's really a financial and strategic advantage. And I believe that when mining is done responsibly, it reduces long-term costs, it mitigates regulatory risk, and it enhances investment appeal because here's why. For instance, like lower environmental impact means fewer regulatory and legal risks. And mines that implement clearer technologies and effective waste management and transparent ESG practices will face far fewer shutdowns and lawsuits and compliance costs. And stronger ESG performance will attract capital. I think investors and banks and institutional funds that are prioritizing ESG compliant projects, they know that cleaner, more socially responsible mining operations will have stronger long-term viability, and sustainability strengthens security. So I think by recovering materials from tailings and recycling metals and implementing more circular economic principles and approaches, mining companies can then extend the life cycle of resources while also reducing those reliance on risky new development. So the bottom line for Sensr 360 is sustainable mining is way more profitable in the long run. And it's not just about doing less harm. It's about building a more resilient, wealth-generating industry that investors can trust.
When people, particularly outside of our industry, talk about sustainable mining, they usually focus on obviously reducing environmental harm. But you framed it as obviously an economic opportunity, as you've been discussing. I just wonder if you can just explain how responsible mining actually creates wealth and long-term investment security.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think number one is, as I said, the world is evolving. So there was a point in time where it's not that I don't think people didn't care where things came from, but people are starting to demand knowing where things come from. Climate change is more prevalent than ever. And that was initially the source of why we actually launched this platform is, mining can in fact contribute in a very negative way and have very negative environmental impacts. So we wanted to start to track and trace and monitor those impacts from space. And so the first iteration of Sensr 360 was actually looking at things like water pollution and topsoil pollution and air quality and air pollution, deforestation, and looking at the contribution that mining has on it. So we can literally use the technology and look back 7 years, look to present day to measure the impact that's been had over that period of time, and then monitor ongoing activity. The reality of it is, we do have a large footprint, but we can monitor and maintain how it's happening and how quickly it's happening. And I think that's one of the reasons also why we wanted to focus on ASM as part of Makor, was because we knew that the footprint, when done responsibly, could be far less significant than a large scale entity. But ultimately, this platform allows you to address those issues and then monitor them over a long period of time.
You have a marketing background, and you mentioned earlier in the introduction about being a good marketer. How would you change the image of mining? Because people outside of mining think it's a dirty industry, not needed. Again, I asked this question to a handful of guests when they come on the podcast. How do you think the mining industry can change their brand sort of globally? What things would you like to see our industry, because we're bad at promoting ourselves? So I just wondered if you had any thoughts around that. And I suppose this is very generalistic question that I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, is there one thing? I don't know. There might be
Probably
few
many.
things.
Probably many.
No,
But is there anything that sort of comes to mind where you think the mining industry, being obviously having a marketing background, where you think it can improve the image of mining for those people outside of our industry, so they understand it more?
Yeah, I think I would start by first of all, let me say, I don't know if there's a perception issue. I think there is a perception issue, and we don't always do a great job at telling the stories powerfully. There is a lot of great things that happen in the industry. Some of the most innovative technologies and the most socially responsible initiatives and some of the best community initiatives I think I have ever seen that create lasting impact, that address systemic issues, that are sustainable at a localized level. Those things happen. And so often we don't tell that story about what's happening and the incredible things that is going on in the industry. If you Google companies, often it's the nonsense and the crap news and all that doesn't work that's showing up. And people love negative news. But if you shift the narrative and you also share about the positive things that are happening, it starts to reframe, I think, people's thinking around it. So that's number one, is, though I don't believe it's just a perception issue, we need to do a better job at telling the stories of also what's really happening on the ground, and connecting those stories to mainstream audiences. And that's why, we've come up with this concept of Mine to Main Street, is because it's so fragmented. We don't realize, if I wasn't in mining, very unlikely am I going to correlate the role that I play in mining. And yet most of the things that I consume and interact and love on a day-to-day basis come from mining. And the reality of it is, I drive demand for the supply that mining is providing, right? And so it's connecting those two worlds when we are telling the story in the narrative. And it's not always about telling it in a very technical way. It's about telling it in a way that somebody, walking down any main street in the world, it's going to understand and resonate with. That's one side. And then I would say there are still challenges in the industry. And we need to start to deal with those things. So I would fix the broken feedback loop that exists between investors and mining companies and the ground level realities. I think that there is a lot of misalignment, unfortunately, still. I think investors don't get real time accurate risk intelligence. I think mining companies, they're still struggling with compliance and permitting delays and unpredictable regulations. And I think consumers still demand sustainable sourcing, but like I said, they don't really understand the real challenges behind it and where things come from. So it would be bridging the narrative amongst all of those and really breaking it down so that you can really start to fix that broken feedback loop that currently exists.
If you could fix one thing in the mining industry today, whether it's regulation, perception, as we've just been speaking about, or the investment strategy, what would it be?
Yeah, I think right now the vast majority of investment flows into large-scale multinational operations. Even junior mining companies struggle with investment, right? never mind artisanal or small scale mines. So I think despite being responsible, ASM, for example, for a significant portion of global gold, diamond, gemstone, and critical mineral production, it still remains largely underfunded and informal and misunderstood. And I think this imbalance isn't just this missed economic opportunity, but I believe it's also a structural failure. And I think that perpetrates inefficiency and environmental damage and economic disparity in resource-rich regions. And then we complain about it. So I think we need a fundamental shift in our investment strategy. I think we need one that moves beyond these outdated risk perceptions, and it starts to recognize artisanal and small-scale miners as investable and scalable in an impact-driven sector. I think formalizing and financing, small-scale mining could unlock immense value, like I said, and not only for the miners, for themselves, but also for investors and for governments and for the global supply chain. So the reality of it is, it's not going anywhere. It's already supplying raw materials to some of the world's most largest industries, from luxury and tech and energy. But because it exists largely outside of those formalized systems and structures, that value is often lost, Rob. It's lost inside of things like smuggling, and environmental degradation, unstable labor conditions. So I think by applying structured investment models and innovative financing mechanisms and technology-driven approaches like Sensr 360, we can de-risk and professionalize ASM, and we can make it an integral and trusted part of the formal economy. And we're already seeing the rise of things like impact investing in the world and ESG-driven finance. So why not leverage that type of momentum and bring things like ASM into the mainstream? And, I think the problem isn't just that ASM is too risky. I think it's that we haven't taken the time to really identify what are the jurisdictions that have adequate legislation to then provide the infrastructure and then provide the capital necessary to mitigate that risk. And I think if we could fix that, if we could build real financial pathways to responsibly scale and formalize ASM, then the ripple effect would be enormous. I think we'd have stronger supply chain resilience, and we'd address some of the world's most pressing human rights issues. And I believe that we'd improve environmental outcomes and more fair wealth contribution and distribution and sustainable mining overall.
You recently released a new podcast that you've got, Mine to Main Street. Just wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about the podcast, and obviously our listeners can subscribe and listen to the podcast. So I just wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about what the podcast is about.
Well, I guess here I'll put you on the spot, Rob, because now I'm going to ask you to be a guest on the podcast, and you can't say no in front of your audience.
Of course I will.
You often host everybody, but I think it'd be great to host you.
That's fine. More than welcome.
That's good. So then we'll circle back with that for everyone. But I've made mention of this a lot. I did not come from the industry, but the industry has given me so much of my life today. My he's from the industry. He's spent 30 years working across all different regions, all different commodities, from underground and coal mines to deep gold mines in South Africa, to running companies and sitting on board seats to where he's at today. And there was a point in our time where somehow this industry that I thought was a real pain because I didn't like mining at first, I grew super fond of the complexities and in seeking solutions to use the industry to address some of the world's most pressing issues, and also just really understanding the role that it plays in all of our lives. And so we married those two worlds together, quite literally. But also we wanted to marry the narratives together. And that's how the Mine to Main Street narrative began. It began a long time ago when we would talk about it with others. But we now wanted to start generating those conversations as well. Like I said, I think as part of the narrative that needs to shift is not just telling the incredible things that the industry is doing and acknowledging the things that don't work, but it's also connecting it to all people in the world, because we all play a role in mining in some way, shape, or form. So we're really excited. We've been busy recording. We did put out our first trailer, and truly stacking recording so that we can give you episodes on a bi-weekly basis. But we've got everything from, podcast hosts and people that run incredible recruitment firms to executives that have been inside of the industry for long times, to people that are building portfolios of extraordinary assets and raising capital, to investors and private equity firms. And that's more industry specific, but also to the miners on the ground, the people that are closest to where things come from and the hands that are touching the things that we all consume. And And we have been interviewing some of the artisanal miners who have so much character and so many stories to be able to share. But then we've got luxury brands and luxury retailers and people that are running incredible governing bodies and institutions to be able to ensure that we operate responsibly as a world, Formula One drivers. So we really have this whole gamut of guests, but they all make sense because they all fall someplace in the value chain. And for us, the show is about connecting everybody in the value chain from mine to Main Street.
Great. And where can our listeners listen to the podcast? Is it on all the major platforms?
It's going to be on all the major platforms. Yes, we do not have their own special social channel. So if you follow myself or Rickis Grumbiak, then you'll be able to get access to our channel as well. But it is on all the major podcast platforms.
Yeah. And lastly, what's the outlook for Makor Resources over the short to medium term?
Yeah, we actually was just talking about this today with our team. I'm in Zambia at the moment, as I shared, for just some field visits that we had to do. We have evolved so much in the last 5 years, never mind the last 6 months, and the team has become, I think, masterful at pivoting, as you have to do in an industry. But, what initially started as just a mine to service company that wanted to create fairness across the value chain and formalize a sector of the industry that we think is often overlooked, that is still a core focus of us. And we are doing a lot of that. But we've also now formed quite a few joint ventures of large scale exploration projects and finding ways to not only obviously identify extraordinary copper assets and critical mineral assets, but also integrate then the illicit activity that's happening on the outside of that into the formal economy and into these operations in time. So spending a lot of time in Southern Africa, in Zambia specifically, because they do have the jurisdiction in place to be able to support artisanal and small scale mining. So we are continuing to build out our portfolio, which we are really, really excited about. And there will be quite a bit of information that's going to be in press releases shared in the coming weeks around that. And the other side of it is we've launched a gold and mercury program. So we're now working with illicit gold miners with the support of the Zambian government and the Ministry of Mines, going into some of these regions to not only formalize these gold operations, but to put in recovery programs. We've got a plant that we have developed that essentially separates and recovers not only gold, but mercury from some of these old tailings dumps. And then we leach with biodegradable product, glycine, and that turns it into fertilizer, which then goes back into these communities. And oftentimes a lot of these illicit miners, they're also subsistence farmers. So really a fully circular economic approach. And that's really on the social side as well, but we're continuing to scale that and really excited about the way that the company has evolved. We will continue to stay private. I've had quite a few people ask that, and that is by choice. So we'll continue to stay a private entity, but really looking forward to the ongoing growth and evolution that we've been seeing.
Yeah. Brooke, really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your story, telling us about obviously Makor Resources, talking about obviously artisanal mining, your experiences living in Africa and obviously working with those artisanal miners. Where can people get access to your social media accounts? Where are you mainly on? What social media platforms are you on? And obviously reaching out for the podcast, how can they contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, my last name is very difficult to spell, so go to the show notes, but everything is going to be at my first name and last name. I'm quite active on LinkedIn and also on Instagram. Again, I like to marry the worlds of my personal life and professional life and how everything comes together. So if you follow me on those two platforms, you'll also get that scope of my life and the work that we're doing. And then obviously also on YouTube and all major social channels, but the big ones are Instagram and LinkedIn, Rob.
Yep, we'll include those in the show notes accompanying this podcast. So thank you again, Brooke. And maybe you want to come on the podcast later this year or next year and give us an update on the work that you've been doing.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate the time and the platform.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed that episode. As always, please share this episode far and wide. Obviously, Brooke has given a good count about artisanal mining. And I suppose our industry, the main mining industry, probably has different perceptions of what artisanal mining is. And obviously Brooks gave a good account of what artisanal miners are. So please keep sharing this episode far and wide to everyone that you know in the industry, just so we can make our industry better and be more informed as to what artisanal mining is all about. Thank you for listening, and until next time, happy mining.
Thank you for listening. Remember to reach out to Rob via the show notes and be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Until next time, happy mining, helping each other to improve the mining industry.